Making sense out of government finance. Budgeting within expenditure restraints and levy limits. Prepared and presented by Denise Vandenbush. Using a fictitious city, the City of Balanced Rock, we'll review the concepts of expenditure restraint, levy limits, and their impact on the budget process within the state of Wisconsin. Using the City of Balanced Rock, we'll prepare a mini city budget. Then we'll layer in expenditure restraint. Then we'll layer in levy limits. Finally, we'll pull everything together in a couple of consolidated slides to illustrate the concepts. In the last few slides, we'll discuss some options to consider to put the city in a better financial position long term. The City of Balanced Rock has a population of 72,000 people. It has a general fund budget of approximately $70 million. It has $6.5 billion of assessed valuation and has an estimated property tax levy of $66.6 million. The City of Balanced Rock has 3 funds that are funded in part by tax levies: a general fund, a capital projects fund, and a debt service fund. Plus, it has a water and sewer utility. First, we'll start with the mini budget. The general fund has $70 million of expenditures balanced with $70 million of revenues. More than 70% of its expenditures are through salaries, wages, and benefits. A city is a service-oriented organization, so it's expected that a large part of its expenditures would be salaries, wages, and benefits. We balance those expenditures with some state-shared revenues, other state aids, and a large payment, expenditure restraint payment, for participating in an expenditure restraint program, which we'll discuss later. With $20 million in other revenues other than property taxes, we will balance this budget with $50 million in property taxes. The next fund is the Capital Projects Fund. The Capital Projects Fund has $20 million of expenditures. This may be for the reconstruction of a pool. It could be for heavy road work and maintenance and building of roads within the city. It could be for the purchase of the fire truck and various capital expenditures such as those. We'll balance those expenditures primarily with bond proceeds, as most of the capital expenditures are expected to have a life of greater than 10 years. We would take out general obligation debt for the city of 10-year debt. We'll also use some state shared revenues to balance this budget, and we'll have a transfer in from the general fund. The general fund collects $1.1 million in property taxes on behalf of the Capital Projects Fund, and we budget and we transfer that in during the year. Our debt service fund is our next fund. We have expenditures of $16.6 million of principal and interest. The city issues general obligation debt every year. So this $16.6 million approximates about 1/10 of the principal and interest that the city owes, which will be paid in the upcoming budget year. The primary revenue source to pay the principal and interest will be property taxes. Property taxes are considered a stable source of revenue, and the city experiences a better bond rating because it is using a stable source of revenue, such as property taxes, to fund those principal and interest payments. We'll carry all the expenditures down, and we have a total of $106,600,000 in expenditures, balanced with other revenues of $40 million and total taxes of $66.6 million. So what does this mean for the tax rate for the City of Balanced Rock? It's a simple calculation with large numbers. We take the tax levy of $66.6 million, divide that by all the assessed property value in the city of $6.5 million, and we have a city tax rate of 10.25. This would approximate on a $200,000 home in the city at a tax rate of 10.25. This particular homeowner would pay $2,050 on their $200,000 home in city taxes. If we were to experience a $1.1 million increase in our levy on the bottom left, we would see that our tax rate would increase to 10.42. So what could the city do, or what might it experience that would keep the tax rate the same at that $1.1 million increase? If we look to the top right, we see that assessed valuation of the property would need to increase by $105 million to retain the same tax rate of 10.25 at a $1.1 million increase in levy. So we've seen a balanced budget. What are the processes or steps that we might go through to balance a budget? We know that our revenues and expenditures need to equal, and we have salaries, wages, benefits, contracts, things like that for expenses on the right, state aids, intergovernmental revenues and grants, charges for public services on the left, and the primary revenue source is property taxes. So what are some things that are putting pressures that might increase our expenditures? Some upward pressures. Inflation. Roughly, we estimate that tied to CPI. Cost of living, or attracting and retaining talent within our city. We may have a growing community, which is adding increased costs for our city. And increased regulations and compliance may add some expenses to our city budget. What are some things that are helping to keep expenditures down? Good financial management. Our elected officials applying gentle pressure to keep expenditures down. And the city participates in an expenditure restraint program. This is an incentive program offered by the state of Wisconsin, where municipalities that are able to keep their increase in their general fund expenditures below a certain percentage reap the benefits of an incentive payment by the state of Wisconsin. We see that the city of Balanced Rock receives an incentive payment of $2.2 million for keeping its general fund expenditures below a certain percentage, tied to inflation and a growth factor. And we'll spend more time with this in the next two slides. So a few odds and ends about the expenditure restraint program. The state of Wisconsin approves a pot of money to be applied and distributed to municipalities participating in the expenditure restraint program. That pot of money is approximately $58 million. That dollar amount was established in 2003 and has remained approximately the same throughout the years going into 2020. There are approximately 450 plus municipalities that have a mill rate greater than 5, which would make them possibly eligible for the expenditure restraint program. Of those eligible, only about half actually receive the payment because they do not meet the rest of the requirements, which we'll look at in a moment. So to qualify, a municipality must have a tax rate of greater than or equal to 5 mills. The city of Balanced Rock, we know, has a tax rate of 10.25, so it meets that requirement. The general fund budget increase, however, must be less than an inflation factor, which we calculate as a one-year average of CPI, plus a valuation factor, which is 60% of net new construction for the city. I think it's always helpful to see the calculation in action. So the City of Balanced Rock has that general fund expenditures of $70 million. Its net new construction is calculated at 1.015%. We can calculate that or estimate that on our own as a city, but the state will also provide that information to us, and it is unique to the City of Balanced Rock. 60% of that places us at 0.609%. We have a CPI increase for the year of 1.85%. That's an average over the past year, rounded to 1.9%, for a total of 2.509%. This allows the city to increase its general fund budget to just under 2.5%, or $1,750,000. So to qualify for that, a expenditure restraint payment of approximately $2.2 million, the city would need to make sure that its general fund expenditures would be below $71,750,000. If it is at that number or a dollar more, it blows expenditure restraint and it would forego the $2.2 million. Property taxes. What are some things that are putting pressure to increase property taxes? If we look at some historic data, and we'll look at a slide regarding this in a moment, state aids have been holding steady or decreasing. We have increasing expenditures. What are some things that are keeping property taxes down? Good fiscal management. Our elected officials with gentle reminders that we need to keep property taxes down. And we have state-imposed levy limits. State-imposed levy limits, I would call a penalty program. Expenditure restraint is an incentive program where we receive funds if we meet requirements. State-imposed levy limits, if we do not meet those limits, the state will take away state aid for us dollar for dollar for each dollar that we exceed the levy limits. Levy limits are tied to a growth factor. Net new construction, we'll look at a calculation of that in a moment. The only way that we are able to exceed our levy limits is through referendum. A few odds and ends before we look at a calculation. Levy limits do exclude collecting property taxes for debt. Debt is outside that limit. If we need to tax to pay our debt, we are able to do that. And we can only imagine how that would wreak havoc on national and international markets if municipalities across the state were not able to make debt payments due to levy limits. So that is excluded from the calculation, and we'll see that in the next slide. All right, we'll look again at some numbers. So our prior year's levy total, as we recall, was $66.6 million. We're going to subtract out the levy for debt, which was $16.6 million, which leaves us at a levy of $50 million. We apply our net new construction percentage of 1.015, and we see that we can have an increase in our levy of $507,500. We could have some additional increases if we were to close a TID, and we'll talk more about that later, but in this scenario, the City of Balanced Rock did not close any TIDs. So the allowable levy, excluding debt, is $50,507,500. We can go ahead and add back our estimated debt for brand new levy, or our new levy for additional debt or new debt for the upcoming year of $16.7 million. So we have a total allowable levy of $67,207,500. We need to be under this amount, or we do not meet the levy limit requirements. All right, we talked about net new construction. The definition of net new construction is essentially we will add any new construction and we will decrease that amount by any demolition or destruction of buildings during a given year. So we have our net new construction divided by our equalized value, which is provided by or estimated by the state, and we have our net new construction percentage that we have been seeing through various calculations of 1.015%. All right, let's pull all these concepts together now. On the left of this slide, we see our general fund, capital projects fund, and debt service fund budgets. Those numbers should all look familiar. In gold, we have our levy of $66.6 million, and we have our general fund expenditures of $70 million. When we apply our allowable increase in our levy of 1.015, we see that we have that $7,000 increase in our levy allowable, and we have a 2.5% increase allowable in our expenditures. The differences between these two, the 1.7 million and the 507,000, is $1.2 million down here. This is the difference, or what I would call the gap. The way to bridge that gap or to narrow that gap would be to either decrease our expenditures down to the 507,000 or find revenues that are non-levy revenues to increase our revenues and balance this budget. The state of Wisconsin it has some restrictions on certain revenues, where if we increase certain revenues, we need to decrease our levy by an equal amount. So we would need to look for revenues that are outside of those restrictions. One more slide here, if we just want to take a look at the importance of net new construction. So in year two, partial budget with the blue here is our calculations that we had just looked at with the $1.2 million gap. If we would have net new construction of 2% rather than 1.015, we see that our allowable levy would increase to $1 million, and we would have a smaller increase in our expenditures of $2.17 million. And so our difference we see is slightly different. We go from a $1.2 million difference to a $1.1 million difference. So the importance of net new construction on our levy capacity is pretty significant. All right. Slide put together by the Department of Revenue, which puts things a little bit in perspective here. At the bottom, this bottom orange colored line shows throughout the state of Wisconsin approximations for charges for public services for municipalities statewide has remained relatively steady from 2006 through 2017, and it is a smaller percentage of our total revenue budget. Property taxes at the top here is the largest portion of municipal revenue, and we see that has remained relatively steady over the years from 2006 to 2017, in part due to levy limit restrictions. We do see the state aids here taking quite a bit of a dip from 2006 to 2012, and it has been holding steady since then. And I would expect that trend, if we would bring this out to 2019 or 2020, we would see that this pattern would continue. All right. So what are some things that a municipality can do? These are not necessarily all recommended options, but it gets us thinking about some things that we can do. The first slide or two will be more global options for a municipality, and the last slide will be department-specific things that we can take a look at. So this was mentioned before. A municipality could seek referendum to exceed levy limits. We know there are political ramifications to this. There are some options here to perhaps reset our base or have a referendum be a one-time increase. It might be for a specific purpose, perhaps for protective services. Some municipalities in the state of Wisconsin are using this as an option. Look for ways to increase our net new construction. Make our city an attractive place for developers to come in and want to build and grow in our community. That first year of net new construction we see is very critical to our expenditure restraint and levy limit restrictions. We could close TIDs. The closing of a TID is really benefits in year one, similar to the net new construction. Half the value of the TID that would be closing, that percentage over its equalized value becomes that bump in percentage for a municipality. And we could have a whole separate presentation on that. We could consider using fund balance. We would never want to use fund balance to fund operations, but perhaps for one-time expenditures if we have significant fund balances. And there are bond rating ramifications if we see a lot of increases and decreases and some volatility in our fund balance, or we see a trend of it decreasing over time. So we need to be careful with that. We could be advocates for changes in the state funding formula. Perhaps put a 2% floor on the levy limit. Those floors were in place back before 2010, but they were removed, and so now levy limits are tied purely to net new construction. No adjustments for CPI. So perhaps advocating to have an adjustment for inflation. Some municipalities are advocating for the use of sales tax, perhaps to supplement property taxes. So that is another avenue. Some municipalities have been able to go back and amend their levy limit worksheets if they perhaps left levy limit capacity on the table. So that might be an option for municipalities. What can departments do? We can explore partnership opportunities with public entities in our community, private organizations, and other city departments to perhaps share in and reduce costs overall. We can consider new revenue sources that are not restricted or do not result in decreases in levy. So considering new revenue sources, and again, a whole presentation could be done on this option. We can reevaluate our staffing needs, particularly when we have new vacancies. We can explore and continue to explore savings through technology. There's lots of new options out there. We've explored a lot and implemented a lot, but we can continue to do that. We can advocate for health and wellness within our departments. Use of citywide clinics and practice well-being techniques and encouraging taking time for ourselves and making sure that we maintain health. We can revisit the idea of acceptable levels of services. Are we providing greater services than our citizens really are willing to pay for? We can reassess our department performance measures. Are some of our performance measures perhaps resulting in us applying resources to reach goals that really are not necessary for providing services to our citizens at the level that they would like? So always reassessing and reevaluating that. So those are some of the options and things that we've looked at. A budget, we've applied levy limits, we've applied expenditure restraint, we've looked at some of the restrictions that we are under, and we have looked at some avenues that we may wish to consider to help put ourselves in a better financial position long term. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.